So, sex. It's everywhere. We see it in the news,
Pressed against her bosom.
on our TV screens, scrolling through our phones. Yet nowadays we don't hear about it from our parents or gym coaches / sex ed teachers.
You will get pregnant and die.
In fact, if you're like me, the closest your school ever came to sexual education was an intense, mandatory assembly concentrated on graphic images of STDs. Given America's fear of talking about sex, it's unsurprising that the topic is almost entirely absent from young adult literature. Or, in the rare case that it is present, is glamorized and only serves to set unrealistic standards for teenagers. Moreover, any books that do have even the mildest mentions of sexuality have a tendency to be banned from school libraries, mostly due to pressure from concerned parents. So the question is, does this underexposure of realistic sexuality in young adult literature actually protect teens, or does it end up hurting them? To start, the genre of young adult, or YA literature, has only been around for about 70 years. Thus, its definition isn't as clear as other genres. However, the basic definition of YA literature simply dictates that the main protagonist is of young adult age. The YA label is not an indicator of the book's contents or maturity level. It does not mean that teenagers are the only age group reading the books in this genre, nor does it mean that sex must be absent for it to be appropriately fit into the genre. So why then are the only references to sex either glazed over, glamorized, or so embellished with flowery language and euphemisms that even 17th century romantic poets would scoff? In an interview with Daniel Kraus, YA authors Krista Deser and Carrie Mesrobian explain how they were only able to distinguish literary flourish from reality in their teenage reading material because they had both encountered sex before reading about it. Mesrobian further explains that sex is generally portrayed only to explore its terrible consequences. For whatever reason, sex in YA literature is almost unanimously linked to drug use and alcohol and other dangerous behaviors. Deser believes that books are a source where even her own teenage daughter searches for authenticity, because she isn't finding it elsewhere. And constantly associating sexuality with danger shatters any credibility authors have with teenage readers. This becomes a problem when teens turn to books to find real answers to sex questions, and are often left more confused and disappointed by their descriptions than they'd been before, making them even more hesitant and fearful of talking about it. The motivations surrounding sex in YA books are a problem in and of themselves. Professor Caroline McKinley examined several female protagonists in various YA books and found that the ones containing sex invariably linked it to self-esteem issues. All of the characters who engaged in sexual acts did so out of need, to be loved, to survive, to keep a boyfriend, etc. This is unsurprising given the tendency for YA books to elevate the disparity between sexual expectations for girls and sexual expectations for boys, i.e., boys can be players and are assumed to have had several sexual partners, while female characters must be pure and virginal. A trend that is harmful to both genders. For boys, who think they need to be experienced to be desirable, and for girls, who think they must have no experience to be desirable, made even worse by the accepted model of always ending up with the first and only boy that they've had sex with. McKinley also examined how the female protagonist felt after having sex, and found that whether the characters felt positively or negatively, the books tended to shame them for their actions regardless. One big reason why sex is viewed this way in YA Lit is because of the roadblocks put up by the genre's publishers. Founder and president of Spectrum Literary Agency, Eleanor Wood, explains that many authors want to include sex, not to be gratuitous or rebellious, but rather to emulate realism. However, they're oftentimes pressured by their publishers to tone it down. This is likely due to the fear of being banned or scorned out of libraries. Patty Campbell, writer for Hornbook magazine, interviewed several parents in an attempt to understand what causes them to advocate for the banning of popular books. They pointed her toward an organization called PABIS, or Parents Against Bad Books in Schools. PABIS's goal, and other organizations like it, is to keep their kids away from books that will influence them to engage in wrongful behavior. For example, sex. They assert that what teens read is what they will do, and have an entire website dedicated to hating on the, and I quote, un-American American Library Association, who have taken the constitutional right of free speech and perverted it into their right to push graphic and explicit smut on children, as well as work to implement their weird social Marxist agenda. PABIS and other organizations like it are dedicated to shielding their teens to a ridiculous degree, so ridiculous that they even penalize Dickens' A Christmas Carol for bad attitude in a character. Probably Scrooge, if I had to guess.
Humbug.
But these parents are so obsessed with sexual negativity that they miss the positive opportunities here. The founders of PABIS aren't wrong in thinking that literature can affect teens. In fact, young adult publishing specialist Jeanne T. McDermott believes that teenagers learn incidentally from fictional reading. Whether they want to or not, teens have been known to copy behavior that they read about in books, which is a trend that adults could take advantage of to teach safe sex if they utilize this medium. Moreover, Lynn Biederman conducted a library survey in 2009 featuring real teenagers and their experiences reading sex and YA. When asked if they'd read any YA fiction with explicit sexual material, 50% of teens aged 16 to 18 said no. More than 40% of teens said that explicit sexual content in books does not make them uncomfortable, while fewer than 40% admitted that it sometimes did. In asking whether it influenced their own sexual behavior, depending on age, 38 to 56% said sometimes it does, and 32 to 68% said it never does. More importantly, when they were asked why they choose to read books with sexually explicit content, the primary reason they gave was to be entertained, while the secondary reason was to explore situations they've not yet encountered, meaning teens aren't viewing sexually explicit books as how-to manuals. Moreover, this shows that teenagers self-monitor what they read without realizing it. In a different study, Professor Angela Boomer Johnson asked some of her YA literature students what they thought YA literature was, and found that most incorrectly believed it to be categorically identical to popular children's literature, and thus doubted its value. McDermott further asserts that different roles and experiences influence opinions on whether YA books belong in the classroom. But she concludes by questioning how a type of media as popular as books such as Harry Potter or Twilight are supposed to stay out of schools, or more importantly, why people would want them to, instead of using them as teaching tools. Professors Katie Rybakova and Ricky Rocanti take it a step further by using YA books as stepping stones to harder literature. They call it scaffolding, or the practice of reading and teaching YA books, like The Book Thief by Marcus Zusak, and connecting it to the traditional canon, such as The Diary of a Young Girl by Anne Frank, through a common event, in this case, the Holocaust. They believe that this tactic could be applied to any subject in YA literature, as teens will learn, albeit unintentionally, social behavior through the reading of such novels. Rybakova and Rocanti also acknowledge that using YA literature in the classroom is oftentimes frowned upon by administrators, worried about the raunchiness. However, it is attitudes such as these that make teenagers afraid to ask questions, and in turn causes them to either do their own research and find even more unrealistic expectations, I think you know what I'm talking about here, or not do any research at all and find themselves in uncomfortable or potentially bad situations. Teenagers have sex. It's just the truth. But if you want statistics, the National Campaign to Prevent Teen and Unplanned Pregnancies 2009 survey showed 46% of high school teens have had sex, while 37% report they are currently sexually active. Planned Parenthood reports that in 2015, by 18 years old, 55% of teenagers have had sex. And even if they aren't having it, teens are seeing sex in media every day. YA literature is an untapped well of potential for teaching teenagers about safe sex and healthy relationships. Utilizing this tool would help set the stage for an open conversation about sex between teens and adults. The genre has a long way to go before it can navigate sex effectively. But for now, it's time to accept that sex is out there. So let's stop fretting over the explicitness of the content and start calling for sexual representation and accuracy in young adult literature.